Hi, everybody. Welcome to another meeting. Nice to see a big crowd out here today. On the surface, free speech is pretty straightforward. Everybody has a voice to speak their mind, but what if some people have different ideas you don't agree with, or maybe that they find that are harmful? Is it okay to stifle someone's free speech with violence? As in, it's okay to punch a Nazi discussion that's gone on in the past year. Maybe you feel it's okay to deplatform or to starve a speaker of an audience. Or maybe you to go further to the other side and believe that unfettered free speech is the way to go, allowing reason and common decency to allow folks such as Milo Yiannopoulos the freedom to talk until they commit social or intellectual suicide. On the surface, free speech is pretty straightforward. As we dig a little deeper, we find that it can be a bit of a quagmire. Helping us sort it all out tonight is Dr. Steven Lecce and his presentation, Is There a Right to Be an Asshole? John Stuart Mill and the Limits of Expressive Liberty. Steven teaches political theory at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba, where he's also Associate Dean of Arts. His research is primarily concerned with contemporary theories of social and distributive justice and the ethical basis of the liberal democratic state. He is author of Against Perfectionism, Defending Liberal Neutrality. He's also the co-editor of Fragile Freedoms, The Global Struggle for Human Rights, and numerous articles about political theory. If Fragile Freedom sounds familiar, the book is based upon the lecture series that took place here in Winnipeg between September 2013 and May 2014 to inaugurate the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Many of us saw noted speakers such as Germaine Greer and A.C. Grayling at this event. Steven has been a visiting scholar at Oxford University's Center for the Study for Social Justice and also Tel Aviv University. He is currently completing the sequel to Against Perfectionism entitled Equality's Domain through McGill Queen's University Press. So, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Steven Lecce.
Just Steve. Thanks. I'm super happy to be here. I didn't know you existed before I got an email from Sherry and Pat maybe a month ago. Count me in. I hear memberships are value priced, so I'm going to sign up and see how many of my friends I can drag along. All right. I will try. How many of you have ever done any philosophy, political theory, ethics in school? Some? Okay. So it's fine because none of this presupposes that you have any background knowledge. I just want to see who I've got in the audience. Okay, so tonight I'm going to talk for, I'm hoping 45, maybe 50 minutes and leave time for questions. We can get a discussion going. I'm going to use Mills on Liberty, which is one of probably the two most famous books in the liberal canon of Western political theory. It was published in 1859 in Victorian England. To raise some questions about the limits of expressive freedom in societies like ours. So the first part, I'll give you a general overview of what the book says, what the argument is. In the second part, I'll narrow in on freedom of thought and discussion. Can you guys hear me at the back? Yeah? Okay. And I'll conclude by asking whether Mill's otherwise compelling argument for freedom of thought and discussion protects assholes from censorship. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to assume that we have a fairly uncontroversial definition of an asshole. Someone qualifies as an asshole if they hold personal views that are sexist, racist, ageist, ableist, some version of anti-egalitarianism. So either that, or they hold political views, vote for political parties, advance public policy designed to further beliefs of that kind. You're a major asshole if you combine personal and political views of that kind. So that's what we're dealing with. And the current occupant of the White House strikes me as perfection on this score. So, does the right to count of freedom of thought and discussion require that we tolerate assholes, maybe even major assholes? Does it require that we supply them with platforms? Or can we justifiably censor them in the name of democratic ideals? So that's the question. All right. Right at the beginning of Mill's book on liberty, he says this, and he announces with remarkable clarity what the point of the book is. He says, "The object of this essay is to assert one very simple principle. That principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. The only purpose for which power can rightfully be exercised over any member of a civilized community against his own will is to prevent harm to others." So in a nutshell, that's the whole book. Don't use the law, especially the criminal law, to restrict people's freedom unless what they're proposing to do is about to harm someone else. Okay? So the book is a defense of what in the literature is called anti-paternalism or anti-parentalism. What does that mean? Fancy words. It means that we shouldn't treat adults like children. As far as adults go, Mill says, each of us is the proper guardian of our own moral, physical, mental well-being. Again, the point is you can never justifiably restrict people's freedom for their own sake, for their own good. Right? So one way of understanding what Mill is trying to get us to accept here is to contrast his position with a much older one, in fact, one that dominates all of Western political philosophy from its beginnings 2,500 years ago with Plato moving forward. For Mill, right, one of the two classic liberals alongside John Locke in the 17th century, it matters, and this group will certainly like this, it matters that it's your reason, your ideas, that you live by. It's not enough that the reasons underlying your actions or beliefs are good ones. They have to be ones you personally understand and endorse. Okay? If we look to Plato's Republic, his famous text, all that matters is people do whatever the philosopher kings tell them to do, because they're smarter than everybody else and their reason dictates for everyone how society ought to be run. Okay? So Plato and most of the Western philosophical tradition, Plato attributes no value whatsoever to intellectual independence or self-reliance. You have to do the right thing. It doesn't have to be the thing that you think is right. Those two things depart. Right? One of the things I want to suggest is that by and large, we, people like us who live in this part of the world in this day and age, are liberals, not Justin Trudeau liberals, small L liberals, philosophical liberals, who accept many of the kinds of limits on political authority that Mill argued for. That is, to most of us, his conclusions sound like truisms. Obviously right, no reasonable person would accept these positions. But it's important to remember that Mill's arguments seem like truisms to us only because it took 150 years to persuade lawmakers, legislators, and the public at large to buy into this, broadly speaking, liberal perspective. Here's one example to show you what I mean, this basic contrast between Plato and everybody else and Locke and Mill as liberals on the other side. I take it for granted, and presumably most of you do too, that there are certain things that states could do, but we don't think that they should. Think of the current obesity epidemic, and it's just one example. The state clearly could make us healthier by controlling our diet, by shutting down McDonald's, by having food supply stores that only sell healthy foods, ministers of inspection who kick down the front door and steal your Cheetos, stop the pizza guy from coming to your house. We could do this. It would work. People would be healthier, their body mass index would be lower, we would live longer, there'd be less incidence of all sorts of things, right? So the question isn't, could it work? Yes, it could work. Is it a good idea? Do we think from the fact that we could achieve this otherwise valuable objective, we should do this? No, that's insane, right? We could tell different stories as to why that's insane, but we think it's crazy. So we think that there's a distinction between what's good for us, individually and collectively, and the kinds of goods that states can justifiably pursue. Right? So liberals, by and large, accept that there are principled limits on the scope of state power. All right, so that's the general argument of on liberty. Personal freedom. Can't tell people what to do. You shouldn't limit their freedom except to prevent harm to others. How does freedom of expression fit into this broader picture? Because chapter 2 of On Liberty, which is going to be my focus, is the most famous part of the book, and it's the thing that makes the book so famous in legislative policy and philosophical circles. Now, Mill is often cited by advocates of, quote, free speech as the key intellectual support for their position. Right? So goals like resisting the regulation and censorship of pornography, defending flag burning, civil disobedience, tolerating hate speech in literature, and so on. All of these things get invoked as possible terrain for Mill's arguments to get played out. What I want to suggest to you tonight is that if we read chapter 2 of the book carefully, the argument is much narrower, and the kind of freedom he's defending is much more limited in scope than both defenders and critics are normally willing to admit. So at the beginning of chapter 2, Mill says this. It's a remarkably strong claim. So listen to this carefully. If all mankind, minus one, were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. So a single dissenting individual, with the rest of humanity disagreeing with him or her, that single individual has the right to express themselves and to be free from political censorship and persecution. The whole world, except for one dissenter, and Mill says, you can't shut that person up. Right? So there are three sets of questions, because this is an incredibly strong claim. First, how does Mill arrive at this conclusion that even a single dissenter, and again, as atheists, agnostics, the kind of coverage that he's defending here presumably is precisely the sort of argument that folks like you can justly appeal to have law, public policy, and also public opinion back off and stop interfering with what you believe and what you want to do. So how does he justify that conclusion? One question that I'll occupy myself with. Two, what exactly is the conclusion? Right? It's not exactly clear what that means. And finally, what problems arise if we accept this basic position? So let me start with the first bit, right? How does he argue for this? How does he argue for the claim that all of humanity cannot justifiably silence a single dissenting opinion? Now, one possible way of arguing for that is to invoke a very old idea that you may have heard of called the idea of natural rights. Presumably, in the case of John Locke, we have these rights. God gives them to us, life, liberty, property, and these rights constrain what anyone can do to us. Right? People have duties not to interfere with their bodies, with their property, and so forth. So, if being able to express your views is an essential part of being human, then maybe the single person's, the dissenter's humanity is being violated when they're not allowed to express themselves, right? And then you could say, the interest in expressing ourselves is so important that we have to protect people's rights to express themselves, even if majorities, or the whole world minus one, are annoyed, right? And usually that's precisely what we mean when we use the word right. A right protects an interest that's so crucial, so important to us, that we don't weigh or balance it against other people's desires or preferences. We protect it regardless of who or how many people are upset. So what's interesting here is that Mill actually rejects this idea of natural rights. So his argument doesn't follow this logic at all. He isn't relying on our personal interest in expressing ourselves. It's not that overrides the majority's disapproval. He says there's something about freedom of thought and discussion, our own individually, that benefits the community. So this is a very different, very innovative kind of argument. And that raises the question, how does granting individuals, unpopular individuals, dissenting individuals, rights to freedom of thought and discussion benefit the community? Especially the community that's pissed off by those dissenting opinions, right? So Mill's not only saying that people do not have the right to be offended. If we read what he's saying carefully, we all benefit from being offended. And that's partly what justifies individual rights to freedom of thought and discussion, It is of a collective benefit to piss people off. Right? So his argument for freedom of thought and discussion is based on the consequences of allowing people to express themselves. But that seems bizarre, because if it's the consequences that we're looking to justify freedom of expression, why don't the numbers matter? Why doesn't there come a point where there are so many people who are upset that their satisfaction, their happiness, their not being offended outweighs the misery that's inflicted on the unpopular, the one dissenting person? And again, Mill's answer is that the happiness of the majority is actually compromised or threatened by restricting individual freedom of thought and discussion. Here's what he says. Were an opinion a personal possession of no value except to the owner, if to be obstructed in the enjoyment of it were just a private injury, it would make some difference whether the injury was inflicted only on a few persons or on many. This is the key part. But the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity as well as the existing generation, those who dissent from it still more than those who hold it. So this sounds a bit nuts, and Mill is taking on a very challenging task. Why is it nuts? He's starting from a theory that has a natural tendency to favor majorities over minorities, right? This is a collective justification for freedom. And he's going to argue that that starting point justifies a virtually unlimited defense of free expression. So how does he do this? All right. And this is the most famous bit of the book. I want you all to imagine that there's some established belief. Say that Jesus Christ is Lord, right? Or there is no God but Allah, Muhammad is his prophet. Something like that, for the sake of argument. Next, imagine that a belief of that kind is challenged by a new belief that's held by a minority. For example, people like you. There are three different possibilities about the relative merits of the majority and the minority belief. First, maybe the new view is right, in which case the society benefits by gaining a true belief and by abandoning a false one. Okay, so that's one possibility. Second possibility, maybe the new view is wrong, in which case we benefit by learning new reasons as to why the established belief is true. Finally, and this is the most likely possibility in most cases, the truth lies somewhere in between both beliefs, or is a hybrid of them, that they each share a part of the truth, as it were. In that case, we benefit by correcting both views and by moving closer to the truth. So, to emphasize the point, Mill is saying that whatever possibility we assume, whoever's right in the debate, we have nothing to gain by suppressing new and controversial beliefs, and we stand to gain in one of three ways. So the argument, if I'm right, is based on the long-term benefits of free discussion for everybody. Now, majorities may find it upsetting or annoying to have their views challenged in the short term, but Mill is saying that they have a long-term interest too in allowing minorities to contest their ideas. Now, sometimes this general argument is referred to as a, quote, marketplace of ideas. You might have heard that expression before, the free marketplace of ideas, ideas clashing and competing in the way that banks compete, ideas compete, and they fight it out to see, which is the best. But I think that's misleading in this case in a few ways. First, economic markets are meant to satisfy existing preferences that people have efficiently. But the whole point of Mill's discussion is that freedom changes people's beliefs, improves them over time, makes them better, more rational, more persuasive, more plausible. Right? So he's not interested in a system that just gives people what they want or satisfies their existing preferences. It's meant to transform them. Second, especially right-wingers assume that markets are efficient and therefore lead to optimal results, but Mill concedes that there's no guarantee that true beliefs are necessarily going to win out over false ones. Right? Again, witness the nightmare to our south these days. So one way of putting this semi-technically, is Mill thinks that freedom and free discussion is a necessary but not a sufficient condition of arriving at the truth. We need it, but it doesn't guarantee that we're going to get to the right place. All right, so that's how Mill argues what he argues. What does he argue? Right? What does this position justify? Now, some people think that this book justifies something called freedom of, quote, expression. And On Liberty, as I've said before, cited as the classic defense of this. It's cited in Supreme Court decisions in Canada and the US in connection with censorship, flag burning, the right of protest, again, pornography. But if you look at the title of the chapter, it's freedom of, quote, thought and discussion. Right? Discussion is something quite specific and something much narrower than expression. So here are some examples of expression. You could urinate on the steps of Parliament. That would be expression. You could start singing now while I'm speaking. That would be expressing yourself. You could moon the Pope Mobile. You could tell jokes. You could dance. All of these things are expressive acts. Okay? Now, maybe you think these things are important. Maybe it is very important for people to express themselves, share their feelings, and be recognized for who they are. And in fact, there's a whole literature in contemporary political theory, the so-called politics of recognition, that takes this line. But that can't be Mill's view, because as I've said a minute or two before, he's arguing from the perspective of social, not personal benefits. All right, so maybe we could say, look, he's not talking about all of expression, he's at least talking about speech. So speech is the category that's protected by Mill's argument. Now, this is a quintessentially American reading of the book, and it connects the First Amendment tradition protecting speech against all restrictions. I think speech is still not narrow enough for what Mill has in mind, because not all speech amounts to discussion. And this is going to be very important when I come back to assholes at the end. Here are some examples to illustrate the point. Hate speech. Calling people who belong to certain ethnic or racial groups inferior, stupid, or lazy, well, that's a type of speech. But the point of doing this is normally to inflict harm, to incite violence, to exclude people, not to discuss anything. And remember, Mill says you can limit people's liberty, and you can only limit people's liberty to prevent them from harming others. Well, hate speech would count as a harm, right? So you could restrict it on that grounds. Pornography, another example. Now, this is complicated, and my students love to discuss this for lots of reasons to no end. It's a broad category. Generalizations are difficult. In some cases, pornography has a purely animalistic motivation, and it's not designed to elicit competing views about the merits of alternative sexual lifestyles. But in other cases, it's plausible that it might be intended to create debate and to challenge existing gender roles, sexual preconceptions, and so forth. So if you look at the secondary literature, some people think that Mill's argument does protect pornography. Others look at the same text and say it doesn't. Art, artistic speech, right? Do poetry and novels amount to discussion in Mill's sense? Well, maybe novels and poems with social and political themes, but I think there'd be clearly no blanket protection for art, no matter the substance or its content. Finally, the difficult case of so-called pseudoscience. Right? I mean, think about half-baked, batshit crazy social science that links race to intelligence, racially motivated Holocaust denials. I mean, these claims sometimes appear in academic journals or university lectures. They advance claims, they often reply to critics. I think these things do have to be protected under Mill's argument. In fact, in certain places, he actually implies we should welcome them. So for instance, a believer in racial equality should welcome racist pseudoscience. Jews should welcome Holocaust deniers. Believers in evolution should welcome creationists, and so on. Because, Mill says, the exchange gives people the opportunity to demonstrate the truth of their own positions, to be challenged to thinking more carefully, and so forth. One final example. Some kinds of speech are so closely related to action that they in fact count as action. So one example that he has, and it's a good one, he describes a mob outside of a corn dealer's house. So Mill says, look, it's one thing to publish an article or to deliver a speech in the town square or to hold up a sign that says, corn dealers are crooks because people are starving given the prices that they're charging. It's another thing to organize a candle-lit, torch-lit rally in the middle of the night on the steps of the corn dealer's house while you're handing out moonshine, right? In that context, in the second context, it's an act that's predictably going to result, or likely going to result, in violence. So I don't think Mill would be bothered by a prohibition against it. Again, back to this preventing harm to others thing. So in general terms, the argument is less sweeping than it originally looks. That's the first part I'm trying to get you to buy into. He admits that there are obviously going to be what we might call boundary problems, right? So he suggests it might be wise to protect some unimportant kinds of expression because it's too hard, especially for policymakers, to distinguish between the garbage that adds nothing to the world and radical ideas that we think of garbage now, or at least the majority does, only because they challenge or threaten existing beliefs and practices. All right, so far I've said a bit about the general argument of the book and what it justifies. What issues or problems arise here? Now, the first have to do with the place of truth in the argument. And the second has to do with how the argument relies on the supposed consequences of personal freedom for the community. And I'll go through each of these in turn. All right. Hopefully from what I've been saying so far, you've noticed that the whole case depends on respecting the importance and the possibility of truth. Right? On liberty, the book comes pretty close to suggesting that a human society is essentially a device for enlarging knowledge. And that's pretty interesting because it challenges a common stereotype. The other canonical liberal you might have heard of, aside from John Stuart Mill, is John Locke in the 17th century, whose one of his famous works was A Letter Concerning Toleration, founding texts for the separation of church and state. So Locke writes this book defending religious toleration at a time where it was not particularly popular or even acceptable. And ever since Locke wrote A Letter Concerning Toleration, people accused Locke of being a skeptic. He kept saying, look, I'm an upstanding member of the Anglican Church, but I think we should stop persecuting people of dissenting religious congregations. And people would say, atheist, skeptic. You have to be an atheist and you have to be a skeptic because if you weren't, you'd be in favor of persecuting these people. And the fact that you're unwilling to persecute them means you must be a skeptic, right? So that original reaction to Locke has trickled down for hundreds of years. In contemporary guise, the argument goes something like this. And it's the association of liberalism or toleration with skepticism. First premise, all beliefs are uncertain. There's nothing we can know for sure, right? Second premise, because of this, we should let everybody think whatever they want and say whatever they think. Conclusion, people who believe in truth are normally dogmatic and intolerant because they want to impose this truth on others who reject it. So there's this tight connection between skepticism and toleration, and between truth and persecution. So which side are you on? That's the binary that is the challenge for liberalism. But Mill, given what I've been saying to you so far, challenges this stereotype about the connection between liberalism and truth, right? Mill's entire argument for tolerating unorthodox or unpopular discussion depends on the possibility of discovering truth. Without that possibility, the whole argument collapses. Now, I want to suggest that this exposes a strength and a weakness in what he's saying. There's a good side to this, there's also a problem. The good side to this is that the skeptical argument for toleration is hopeless, I think, and confused. So it's good that Mill's argument doesn't depend upon this. And let me explain that. You can't construct an argument from skepticism and arrive at liberalism or tolerance because if we can't know anything, right, if there's no reasonable way to establish the plausibility of certain positions and the idiocy of others, we also can't establish the plausibility of tolerance or liberalism. So you can't justify liberalism on the basis of skepticism because nothing follows from skepticism. I know some of you are going to ask me about this later in connection with some other things, or at least I anticipate that, and I'm happy to talk about it. So I want to suggest that Mill's case is much better than the one that's at the core of the common stereotype. The weakness, though, that comes from this is also because of the great emphasis he places on truth, which not everyone is willing to do. I mean, historically, many persecutors, the people willing to impose their views on minorities, haven't given a damn about the truth. They want power. They want to inflict misery. They want to inflict suffering. Again, Trump, does he care about the truth? Not particularly, right? So an argument that has the enlargement of truth in the name of tolerance is not likely to persuade him. It's an irrelevance. Mill's argument is not likely to be very convincing to people who recognize the possibility of truth, but who also think that other things might be more important. And this is an interesting possibility. So, for example, in the 1930s, many physicists wanted to stop research into the structure of the atom because they correctly foresaw what people would likely do with this knowledge once they had it. They would weaponize it. Right? So the idea here is that some truths, some knowledge, it might be better to leave undiscovered, unknown. And the supposition that the more we know, always the better, might be problematic. So here, Mill seems to be running into some trouble because his argument implies that it's always best to know more. All knowledge is better, and the more we have, the merrier. There might be reasons for doubting that. The second set of problems arise from how he constructs his case, which links, again, personal freedom to social consequences. And the examples that I'm going to go through now indicate what might be problematic for this view of freedom of thought and discussion. So the first example is children. In many cases, children's freedom has to give way to the protection of their basic health and security, right? Think of my 7-year-old daughter who for a while thought it was a good idea, well, not at 7, but earlier, to stick a fork or a knife into an electrical outlet. Right? Is there any reason to respect a child's freedom there? Surely not. And at that particular point, Mill concedes, yes, we don't have to respect the autonomy of children. We can justifiably limit their freedom for their own good. So that harm principle that I started off by describing, it doesn't apply to kids. It applies to mentally competent adults. He's got 3 other examples that are more concerning for him. I mentioned Plato before, the father of Western political theory, who wrote the Republic 2,500 years ago. Socrates was Plato's teacher, and Socrates was executed by the Athenian city-state for impiety, disbelieving in the gods, and for corrupting the youth. Those were the 2 charges. So this example, Mill tells us that the freedom that he's defending, freedom of thought and discussion, is one that can only be afforded to societies that have achieved a certain level of security and wealth and affluence. And for example, Greek city-states, which were constantly at war with one another, had to maintain a tight discipline because dissent would have been too costly. So Mill's point is that Greek city-states couldn't wait for the long-term benefits of freedom in the way that he's suggesting. Short-term survival took precedence in the way that the child's security did in the previous example. So from this, it would seem to follow that the Greeks' execution of Socrates was justified, but he says that this is the greatest crime the human race ever committed. There's a similar case, too, in the context of developing countries today. Political and economic leaders in the developing world often say that they can't afford political dissent, right? Allegedly, only rich countries can. We can't tolerate a free press. We can't have a critical opposition party. We need to generate wealth. And once we're stable enough, then you can have your opposition parties and your free press. In practice, that leads to something called managed journalism, and this is very convenient for dictators. And unfortunately, Mill has no answer to any of these worries. Now, one final problem that arises in connection with this argument, this truth-based argument. Imagine one day that we come to know everything. Then what? Mill tells us that free discussion is good because it leads to increased knowledge of the world, but suppose that our knowledge becomes complete. His argument seems to imply that there'd be no longer any case for personal freedom. Now that might seem silly to us, but it wasn't to him. He describes what we would call a fact-based view of knowledge. This is the quintessential Enlightenment dream, that with enough experiments, with enough time, with enough science, we'll have all the facts. And an argument of the kind that he develops seems to run out of steam at that point. So if he were to follow his own argument consistently, he'd have to say that the case for freedom would no longer apply, but he doesn't say this. He says, we're going to have to stimulate argument artificially if we ever get to this point. In fact, we'll have to pay people to tell us lies so that we can continue to argue with them. I'm serious. Now that sounds farcical, but there's a serious point underlying it. He's trying to get us to believe that it's not enough for us to know the truth, whatever that is, scientific, economic, philosophical, whatever. We have to hold the truth in a thoughtful or reflective way. Right? So he's saying that it would be better for us to believe in something that's true if we've arrived at the belief through a process of critical reflection than it would be for us to accidentally apprehend some truth because an authority told us to, a professor, a priest, an imam, whoever. Now, if you invite me back next time, I'll tell you why something of that kind implies that we should abolish religious schools. So let me end by coming back to the stars of the show, assholes, in light of this philosophical stage setting. So does liberalism require that we extend toleration to assholes too? Now remember, an asshole is someone whose personal views or political convictions are objectionably sexist, racist, homophobic, so on. A major asshole has those views and also advocates for political positions, parties, candidates that would institutionalize those patterns of discrimination and anti-egalitarianism. I struggled with this a bit. I think the right response is in a way a kind of hybrid, and I'm going to equivocate back and forth. I'm going to say two things that lead me to believe that we have no obligation to tolerate assholes, and then I'm going to really end by suggesting there are three reasons for thinking that those two reasons might not be as good as I think they are. So, pros and cons, and then you guys can sort this out for yourself. All right, first, if we read beneath the lines, or if you listen between the lines to everything that I've been saying, you'll notice that the foundation of Mill's argument for freedom of thought and discussion is ultimately equality. Right? The bedrock of this liberal philosophy is the claim that we are one another's moral equals. My interests in health, in security, and liberty can't count for any more or any less than yours in the calculations that make up law and public policy. So from the perspective of the state, the government has to assume that we all count the same. Nobody's any better than anybody else. White, black, male, female, immigrant, whatever, right? We can't distinguish between people from the moral and therefore the political point of view. So it's because we are one another's equals that Mill thinks this argument gets off the ground and it has the structure that it does. So this way of seeing the social and political world, which I think is fundamentally right and decent and sane, implies a couple of things. As an asshole, you can't rightly complain about my silencing or marginalizing you. Because on the basis of your idiotic beliefs, you would use political power to silence, say, Jews, blacks, queers, atheists, whoever. And second, the protection that Mill has in mind is meant for, as I've been trying to emphasize, reasoned discussion that has truth as its goal. But assholes often simply invoke rhetoric or propaganda or various forms of manipulation to subvert rational discussion, to circumvent evidence, and in general impose their views on others. So what I'm trying to say is that what assholes typically spout is not likely covered, at least directly, by the protections that Mill thinks advance our knowledge of the social, political world. So I think the case for silencing assholes is presumptively justified. At first glance, this is a compelling thing. And I think that's right at the level of philosophy, at the level of political theory, philosophical analysis. But there are some reasons for worrying about that, where I think, it would be nice to silence the asshole, punch the Nazi. But here are some second thoughts. Law, and especially criminal law, has what we might call an expressive function. Okay, so beyond simply deterring or penalizing antisocial behavior, Our laws also express and partly constitute our society's fundamental norms, our values, what we believe in collectively. And when we extend toleration to assholes, and we extend toleration to them that's not strictly required by a direct appeal to liberal principles of freedom and equality, I think there are certain cases where we're signaling what we stand for individually and collectively, and we're refusing to become what we oppose. So seen in this light, toleration, liberalism, is as much, maybe more about who we are, and less about the things that we rightly find abhorrent, disgusting, vile. So in the same way that I think we shouldn't become authoritarians to fight terrorism, we shouldn't give up civil liberties in the name of our security, we can't become intolerant prudes to fight assholes. And that means putting up with things that you really, really, really shouldn't accept on principled grounds. Next, this book was partly prompted by a really dangerous trend that Mill detected at the dawn of the democratic age in the 18th and 19th century. One that confused or equated democracy with freedom. See, in the old days when there was a king, you needed protections against the king because it was clear that you didn't have power, he did, and he might come after your liberty, your property, your religion, right? So there's power up there and there's you down here. With the advent of democracy, there's no more king. We're all the king, right? Democracy is collective self-rule. And people started to think, well, we don't need individual rights anymore because why would we oppress ourselves? We, the people, aren't going to oppress ourselves. And we find this in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's famous book, The Social Contract, and elsewhere. So the idea that democracy and liberty are the same thing. One of the brilliant aspects of Mill's book that I haven't talked to you about today, not in any great detail, is Mill says that it's actually worse and more dangerous when political power moves from the king to majorities, because people start thinking we don't need protection in the same way that we did before. And also in democracies, the one thing that's as coercive and potentially as threatening to your interests as the state is public opinion. And public opinion, Mill says, dominant attitudes about religion, about sex, about all sorts of things, can be as oppressive, if not more, as law and public policy. So Mill is saying it's a mistake to think that now that we're in the age of democracy, we've guaranteed personal freedom, right? It shouldn't make any difference whether it's the king who's bullying you or persecuting you or a democratic majority. A lack of freedom is a lack of freedom, irrespective of the source of the deprivation. So Mill is suggesting that in a democracy, we do need individual rights to protect us against political majorities, but we also need protection from the potential tyranny of custom, tradition, and dominant attitudes of all kinds. So deplatforming, right, refusing to give someone whose views you dislike or you find objectionable, deplatforming as a practice, in general, might be the activity of silencing the unpopular in the name of tolerance. And that's a dangerous paradox. In the end, I actually think whether or not liberal democracy can survive the persistence of illiberal, intolerant expressions of various kinds, assholes, is really an empirical, it's a factual question, not a philosophical one. And the answer to which kinds of assholes we should tolerate, when and for how long, is going to turn on a whole range of contextual variables. So again, while I think the argument for toleration is presumptively justified, right? In the name of liberty, equality, democracy, we should put up with people who probably don't have a claim to our forbearance. But let me end by suggesting that there's every difference in the world between tolerating illiberalism, putting up with it, and magnifying what assholes spout. As I said, whether or not deplatforming assholes is the right thing to do is a strategic, not a philosophical question. And the answer is going to depend upon which option in any given case is more likely to move society in the right direction. So in a nutshell, this is what I'm arguing, my central conclusion. Even if the right to be an asshole is a central liberal democratic right, In fact, liberal democracy is fundamentally committed to the proposition that everyone should be allowed to be an idiot if they want to. Assholes can't invoke that right to demand a particular platform for their nonsense. So sane, decent people have to put up with assholes out of respect for our basic values, but we're under no obligation to also give them a microphone. Thanks.
Now we'll have a little Q&A. I was just thinking of all the questions I could ask when I was thinking there, but I kept coming back to the same thing of thinking of all the controversial discussions I've had in the past and trying to file them under, are they assholes or major assholes?
Right.
So we'd really like your questions on the recording, so we're going to pass around the mic, and I guess I'll run around the room and make sure we can record them.
Thank you very much for your talk. I enjoyed it a great deal. I wanted to have you comment on what I understand are algorithms that Google and Facebook are using to manage the opinion generating public, and how whether that private sector choice over what will be published broadly should come under a different form of control than having the executives of those private corporations manage the algorithm.
So I confess to not knowing very much about how the algorithms function and, you know, the technological aspect of it. It seems to me the interesting question at the level of political theory, not the technological bit, is the extent to which we want the kind of surveillance and monitoring decentralized and therefore overseen by corporations, and so that you can have, in a way, a marketplace where, you know, these companies compete with one another. They compete for market shares, they compete for subscribers, they compete for advertisers, and so on. And that's a way of sifting out sort of the crap and drawing attention to the nonsense, as opposed to centralizing the oversight in the political bureaucracy. So for me, the question would be, if we have a reasonable idea of the kinds of things that we find beyond the pale and therefore intolerable, right? So not just the minor case of assholes, but criminal. What is the most reliable detection and enforcement mechanism? But again, that strikes me as a purely factual or empirical thing, not a philosophical one. So I think the person that you want to ask that question is a software engineer, not a philosopher or a political theorist. It's a good question. I don't know what the answer would be to that.
I'm not sure if this is how you were summing up at the end there, kind of implying maybe that Donald Trump should have, we should be listening or tolerating their opinions, but not give them a strong platform. First of all, if that's what you were saying, isn't Trump, though, getting the platform from the media because he is simply the most newsworthy person around?
Yeah, I mean, the example that mostly comes to mind, and the live issue for me is in connection with universities, where you have someone who's a really unpopular speaker, and, you know, universities these days all over the place are deciding to revoke invitations, and often in the name of security concerns. But what they seem to really be doing is caving to political pressure, because there's a critical mass of people who find their views offensive or upsetting. And, you know, that's one of the most dangerous turns that I see in my profession, where universities have now become safe spaces where people are fragile, and the idea is to cultivate a classroom space, a lecture hall, an auditorium where no one is upset. And I don't think that that's what universities should be about. So the deplatforming comment, I mean, I guess what I think is that beyond the examples that I gave you before, right, the incitement to violence, hate speech, the clearly identifiable cases where I think we have a clear right to silence people and to prevent harm to others, I think we should tolerate virtually everything in the sense that we shouldn't use the authority of the state to silence people. But that doesn't mean that we have to guarantee people an audience or allow them to access whatever venue that they might wish to speak at. What you'll often find is people complaining of their expressive liberties being deprived simply because they've been told, you can't speak here. We've decided, the Board of Governors has decided that you can't come here. I think the mistake is in thinking that your expressive rights guarantee you an audience and a platform, and that doesn't seem to follow. So I'm particularly concerned about the power of the state that's used to silence dissenting opinions. But I'm less troubled by people who are upset because people aren't coming to listen to them, or they're not getting access to the same fora that other people are getting access to. So, one of the corollaries of having the right to be an asshole is you have an obligation to put up with the consequences of your attitudes and your behavior. What people often want is the right for radically free speech and to propagate whatever they think, and then they complain when they're being ostracized socially or otherwise, but they're being disinvited, those are expressive liberties being exercised too on behalf of the audience. You're an asshole, I don't have to listen to you, I don't have to go to your show, I can withdraw my money or my grant from your institution, I can. So it's a two-way street. And the focus on the speaker as opposed to the audience, I think, is somewhat myopic, particularly in connection with what's happening in universities these days.
I agree with what you just said, but I have another question about it.
Sure.
Last month, Richard Spencer booked a venue at a university in Florida for a speech. And there was a lot of, he's a white supremacist in the US, well known.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of pushback and a lot of demonstrations and a lot of, trying to shut it down. The university tried to back out and he threatened to sue. And so they allowed him to go ahead and ended up being on the hook for $500,000 in security costs because of having to let the university, I guess, under legal pressure, had to let him go ahead with his talk. And then they had to, between the university and the Florida taxpayers, $500,000 worth of security. So how would you have handled that or recommended that either the government, the university, the public would have handled that? Because these things are coming with huge costs in order to protect this so-called free speech.
They could build less weapons and use the money to fund. It's probably an insignificant amount, and I think taxpayers should be on the hook. If expressive liberties are guaranteed constitutional rights, if it's part of the public political culture of a country, then there should be a price tag, and the price tag is likely going to be significant, and rights cost. I don't see a problem with taxpayers being on the hook. It's part of the price of protecting expressive liberty. If the protections, in a way, if the protections are only there for expression and speech and discussion that doesn't offend people or isn't problematic, it's not needed. You only need it to the extent that it's going to be invoked in the context of things that really upset people, right? So I think it's a price that has to be paid. And if we're going to start silencing people or not protecting people, one worry that I have is that you can invoke security and you can invoke finances as an indirect way of regulating content. And you just say, well, it's going to cost a bunch to allow this event to go forward, so we're not going to allow it. The objection isn't really about finances. It's about this guy's a scumbag and we don't want him here, right?
I'm just wondering, when does something like deplatforming become censorship? Often, whenever whatever speaker is deplatformed, you'll hear the screams in the blogosphere and that, oh, they're being censored. And I always have trouble with this because freedom of speech is very much a personal thing. They can still have their web pages and their newsletters and all that kind of stuff. But is deplatforming censorship or censorship light?
Personally, my short answer is no. It's more problematic in the context of institutions that receive significant public funding and are accountable to the state, because if you've got political influence there, you might have the state indirectly regulating content, but otherwise, no. As I said, but part of what I was saying at the end was that I can't imagine a plausible conception of expressive freedom which guarantees you access to specific platforms. So if a university, for example, I mean, I think it's a bad idea, but if a university decides it's going to deplatform or uninvite somebody because of the costs or the political blowback or whatever, presumably there'll be social consequences to that too. There'll be political lobbying for funding to be withdrawn. There'll be questions raised about, the Board of Governors and who controls them. And so the short answer is no, I'm not troubled by that.
Can you comment on the guy who was in Winnipeg on Wednesday?
I don't know the guy. Who's the...
Oh God, I can't remember the name. A white supremacist. From. The last name was F-R-O-M. Richard From.
Oh.
Anyway, okay, so he was the scoop is that he was in Winnipeg on Wednesday. He was advertising that he was going to speak at, I guess he advertised to his followers.
Yeah.
It was going to be at the Hilton Hotel near the airport here. Mm-hmm. But the news, as you're saying, you're not guaranteeing people an audience. Basically, the news media pretty much boycotted it. It's like they didn't want to promote it.
Yeah. Let me shift gears to one university-related story that I am personally familiar with because we were involved. The person sitting behind you there with the red hair, Sarahan, and she's the other political theorist from my department. She's also one of the directors of this ethics center that I belong to. A couple of years ago, we decided that we wanted, right after the Conservatives, well, when they won before they lost, some of you may know who Tom Flanagan is. He is a political scientist at the University of Calgary who was intimately involved with the Harper government and one of Canada's leading experts on polling data, voter science, all that kind of stuff. And the Conservatives, I would never vote for them, but politically they were geniuses at the time. And the stuff they were doing around electoral data and polling was incredible. And because I had a connection, there's another Steven Lecce, my cousin, who was Stephen Harper's chief communications guy for a while, knew him. We got Flanagan to come to the U of M to talk about the science of polling and winning elections. Well, Flanagan got into some trouble because one of the other things he did was publish a book called First Nations Second Thoughts. And in this book, he argues that the best thing that we could do for Indigenous people in Canada is get rid of the Indian Act, shut down reservations, have Indigenous people have access to credit and banking and private property like everybody else. In essence, integrate into the mainstream economy. And that's the best thing that we can do. So if we care about the harm of colonialism, and if we actually care about drinking water and sanitation and the health of Indigenous peoples, we have to completely alter what we're doing. The backlash, especially in political science and philosophy departments in Canada, was quick. Racism, colonialism, this is just taking John Locke's arguments for colonialism and ramming them down the throats of Indigenous Canadians, and this is, this. So he was labeled a racist like the second the book came off the press. And as soon as we announced that Flanagan was coming to the Ethics Center to talk about polling, the protests started. And the letters went to the Free Press, and people were calling the CBC, and they were going to come, and there was going to be a huge deal. And we had to decide, what are we going to do about this? Because we've got this guy that, a large constituency of our school considers a racist. We do recognize the problem of colonialism and the plight of Indigenous peoples. We're not insensitive to this. I don't want to platform this guy, and maybe his views can be spun charitably. Maybe he is a racist, I don't know. But he's a polling genius, and he's coming to talk about polling. So the position that we took was, he's coming, we'll have security, we'll advertise to people that in no way we're endorsing his views about anything other than his polling expertise, and the fora will be about that. So we packed the auditorium, people came. For the first 45 minutes of an hour and a half, he was talking about basically how they in a way managed to steal all the votes in and around the 416 area in Toronto with the immigrants, and they did this and they did that, and it was fascinating, right? Our politics students were learning from a master tactician on how to win elections. And now, whether you're a conservative or not, these are skills you probably want to learn, especially if you're not a conservative, right? But 45 minutes into it, people started yelling and screaming and shame, and it got really ugly. And, security came, and some people were escorted out, then things quieted down. But in the end, I think we did the right thing, because he was invited to speak. We weren't endorsing his views about anything that people were objecting to. And I found the counter arguments, you're embracing colonialism, completely unpersuasive. I just thought, this is a university. People are coming to talk about expertise. This is a credible expert in their field. You might find him offensive. You might find me offensive. If I could tell you, about certain aspects of my beliefs, my upbringing, he stays. So anyway, the basic point is, I think universities have gone way overboard in trying to protect students from being upset, for being offended. I think Mill is onto something when he says we all stand to benefit from having our fundamental beliefs and values challenged. We're either going to swap them out for better beliefs, or we're going to dig in and have better reasons and more persuasive grounds for defending our own. And a democratic society cannot protect people from being upset. We just can't. I mean, I just don't think you have the right not to be upset or not to be offended, as the ad for this thing suggested. And if we start trying to devise curricula and teaching classes, particularly in the social sciences and humanities, in ways that immunize people from upset, we may as well just close up shop. In some of the courses that I teach on the history of Western political philosophy, Plato to Marx and on, I often have students who come and look at the syllabus and say, without exception, these are all white guys, dead white guys. This isn't what we should be teaching anymore, and this isn't the image of the university that we should be signaling to people as the only white men from the western part of the world are capable of generating knowledge, and this is sexist and this is racist. And my answer is, yes, it's racist and it's sexist, and the history of the West is racist and sexist. It's better not to whitewash that and admit this is the canon of Western political philosophy. We're adding to it now. There are critical perspectives that were left out. We can modify it, but let's just confront the fact that this is what it was. Yes, it pisses you off. Tell me why it pisses you off, and we'll talk about it. Who do you think we should include next year on the canon? So I just think that the deplatforming, the thrust of it is well-intentioned, but super, super dangerous, especially in universities. That's the last place where you want people not to be able to think and say unpopular thoughts. Unless they're directly inciting violence, or they're engaged in hate crimes, I think universities need those people.
I have trouble finding the dividing line between hate speech, which I think you're saying we have the right to prevent and prohibit, and offensive speech, which we don't. Where do you draw the line between the two?
It's a good question. So part of the trouble with offense is that it's often used in a subjective sense, right? It's an emotive, it's an affective thing. So, and in a way, it's sort of content independent. So if I'm a Klansman, not in the Scottish sense, but in the KKK sense, I'm offended by black people. If I'm an anti-Semite, Jews offend me. So if you're going to protect me from offense, you need to get rid of those people. So the problem of just simply protecting people's feelings and protecting them from offense, irrespective of the content of either the grounds for their objections or what they're objecting to, is a super dangerous thing. And I think, again, in the context of universities, that's primarily the type of offense we're talking about. I'm upset by something. Something pisses me off. I don't like that, right? Whereas if you're talking about hate crimes, and I'm not a legal scholar, so those are the people to ask specifically about how to devise legislation for that, you're usually identifying narrow criteria and designated categories. So you cannot point to people and say, because of your race, because of your gender, because of certain set of identifiable or ascriptive characteristics, you, either individually or via the state through law and public policy, can discriminate against me or treat me in a specific way, right? So part of the distinction trades on the subjective-objective one, and the idea is to tailor legislation in a way that really narrows it down. So because the protections are so stringent, and because the arm of the law comes down so heavy when those protections are violated, the category has to be super, super narrow. Offense is not a narrow category. Again, racists, homophobes, anti-Semites, they're all offended by everybody, right? So making society a safe place for them is not an attractive idea. Atheism offends people, right? So do we want a conception of offense that's subjective in that sense? No. And again, back to the universities, only because that's where I work and where I live, that's the trend. We need to protect people from being upset. Yes, we have respectful workplace policy. Yes, you can't insult people in class. Teachers have to treat their students with respect and all that kind of stuff. But that doesn't mean every time I give a lecture, I have to give an even, balanced presentation of all political and economic viewpoints, failing which I've discriminated against you and you bring me before the tribunal of political correctness and Lecce should lose his job because he offended me. Well, too bad.
How about, if I may, just
Yeah, sure.
Supplementary, how about racial slurs, for example, using the N-word? Is that hate speech or is that offensive speech?
I think it should be grounds for dismissal if you're a political functionary, if you're a civil servant, if any part of your pay is derived from taxes. I think in a private corporation, as an employer, you should be perfectly within your rights to fire somebody who behaves that way. But I think you should be able to say such things. I mean, should you be able to jail somebody for speaking that way? No.
How about in a university class? Should you be able to use words like that in your class?
No, I mean, we have a respectful workplace policy that says that if someone behaves in that sort of way, they can be expelled. Because it creates a threatening learning environment and people don't feel safe. But again, I see what you're getting at, and the slope is slippery, but I think that's clearly on one end of the scope. That's different from saying something offensive. Like, it would be one thing to have a kind of crackpot, semi-social scientific argument for apartheid, where you say, South Africa, apartheid era South Africa, it wasn't all bad. And you tell some sort of story about the efficiency of labor markets, and you talk about, whatever, right? As an instructor, I think you're an awful human being, but your grade isn't going to reflect that. If you can construct a compelling case for what you're describing, I'll dislike you immensely, and I hope you'll never be back in my class, but your grade isn't going to suffer. But that's different from in the middle of the class letting N-words fly, right? Then you're intimidating people. It's a disrespectful work and learning environment, and we have rules for that. And it's the same thing with academic freedom. I mean, as Pat mentioned in the introduction, I have the grave misfortune of working in the dean's office, being an administrator, not just a teacher. We often have colleagues who invoke academic freedom to protect them because they're assholes. I mean, your academic freedom is the freedom to research topics of your own choosing, to arrive at conclusions that you arrived at independently, not to be bullied by, the board of governors or the government, not to be pressured to move your opinions one way or another. You're protected to teach your classes how you like. That's your academic freedom. Your academic freedom is not the freedom to, behave like an asshole. So I think in a way, universities have gone overboard one way in protecting especially students from offense. And in another way, they've encouraged faculty to become critical assholes, monumental assholes in a way that undermines the project of the university. Sarah, don't tell anybody I said that. I didn't mean her. Yeah, I probably just lost my job. You're filming this, right? Yeah.
So in the spheres that I kind of run in, I hear a lot about Jordan Peterson and God Saad these days.
So what are those fears? Just
the blogosphere. I have a lot of libertarian friends, and they're constantly on me, like all the time. What about this? What about this? What about this? And a lot of time I'm like, I don't know. So I guess their claims are like the universities are now like a hellscape of postmodernist, neo-Marxist ideas, and and so forth, and hard sciences at risk. And
Yeah.
have you seen like being on the ground on that in that area?
So I'm co-teaching a new class next term, provocatively entitled Conservatism. You'll be amazed to know that notwithstanding the fact that conservatism is so influential socially, politically, economically in most of the Western world today, it's not really taught in politics and philosophy departments. You get Marxism and socialism and liberalism and all that kind of stuff, but it's a kind of understudied thing. So one of the things I'm trying to do in an effort to understand this thing is to teach it. Partly because I think our students need a bit of pushback in that direction. So is the caricature correct? Are universities, especially in the liberal arts and social sciences, what did you call it, a postmodern nightmare?
Well, it's more what Jordan Peterson might say.
Philosophy, philosophy, politics, sociology, history departments, faculty tend to pull left of center. As a general caricature, that's probably right. I think there is a lot of informal pressure, especially in connection with hiring, when we have new tenure track positions in departments to hire people on the progressive end of the spectrum. I don't think that's entirely a bad thing, because I think a lot of the other stuff really is crackpot. But the idea that there aren't top-notch right-wing economists, political philosophers, sociologists, criminologists is insane. There's super smart people working from that perspective, and they do have a harder time than center, left of center people making their way into the academy in the social sciences and humanities. So I think your friends are partly right. And that's partly why I think, when you're talking about Spencer and the others who are really distasteful in lots of ways, maybe in all ways, the provocation, if Mill is right, might be a needed corrective to the stagnation that you would get in certain institutions when the center of gravity is consistently left of center. Even if I think those views are essentially correct, which I do on all sorts of things, it's still nice to work in a place where people disagree with you, for all of the reasons that Mill points out, right? And often you find departments where everybody's just parroting what everybody else is saying, and we teach courses that way. Not all of us, right? I like to think that Sarah and I are not in that boat. As I said, I'm teaching conservatism next term. But it was astonishing to me that in the history department, in the philosophy department, in the politics department, no one was teaching this thing. It's like, it runs the government. It runs the government to the south. It runs the government in Europe. It runs the government in lots of places. Does anybody think we should take time to understand what this is? If only to oppose it, right? The economics of it, the sociology of it, the criminology of it, whatever. There are biases.
So, as I guess a follow-up, do you have like a quick soundbite definition of what you think conservatism is? And is it accurately what you would call conservatism? Is it accurately represented in the political parties that we see? Like, for me, like I would say what's down south would be republicanism or something. Like it's morphed into some sort of weird dystopian, I don't know, image of itself that just doesn't seem to make sense anymore.
Yeah. And the good news is, one of the reasons why Trump's legislative agenda might not go anywhere, if you happen to think it's a bad idea as I do, is that there really isn't anything called conservatism. There are conservatisms. It's a family of ideas, and they pull in all sorts of different directions. So you have one strand of conservatism, which has its affinity in Locke, and Adam Smith as classical exemplars, and Hayek and Friedman and all of that, which is basically the idea is that in the same way that democracy protects us from the king by dispersing political power, right? Democracy is basically a political market. Decentralized power through a plurality of votes. Economic markets are a way of also freeing us. So you have this line that equates capitalism with freedom of a specific kind, right? Those are the libertarians. And they're in favor of, the minimal state, minimal taxation and so on. You also have social conservatives who are less focused on markets, Although to the extent that they do, they look at markets not as primarily engines of efficiency and growth, but as rewarding virtue and industriousness. So you have a kind of Protestant work ethic that supervenes onto capitalism. And rich people are rich because they're smart and industrious and rational. And poor people are poor because they're lazy and imprudent and make bad decisions. So if you have that moralized view of capitalism, you can see why the redistributive state, the welfare state, rewards vice and subsidizes, laziness and that kind of thing. You have conservatives, the economic ones, who think that the minimal state, low taxes, little government intervention is the way to go. How do you reconcile that with the social conservatives who want the state involved in the family, marriage, church, the educational system? So the partly what the Republicans are struggling with in the States is the same thing Harper did in connection with the Reform Party and the Alliance and all of the rest of it. Harper just wanted to win power and wanted, lower taxes. And I don't think he really cared a whole lot about same-sex marriage. And I don't think he cared much about polygamy. And I don't think he cared really about pot. And every time somebody started talking about, the gays, stop. We're going to alienate all of Toronto. We're going to lose this election, right? Don't do that. Just low taxes for everyone. Everybody can get on board with that. We'll win the election. And then after that, we'll go back to the social conservative base and see if we can pacify them. So these things, socialism, liberalism, conservatism, again, they're not single things. They're very complicated families of ideas. And what you're seeing are internal fights as to which of those will have the dominant coalition electorally at any given time.
Recently, Bill 34 was passed in Manitoba that says if a patient wants to discuss all of their end-of-life options and you are of a religion that says you don't want to discuss all of the end-of-life options, then they need to protect your religious freedom by saying you don't have to go find a staff member to talk to the patient. So that someone in their most vulnerable point of their life.
Say the last part again. The law stipulates that if at the end of your life, if you can't, or if you've not identified or designated a specific religious background, then what happens?
If you are a healthcare worker who's a Christian, for example, who's against medical assistance in dying, Bill 34 says you don't have to help the patient get the information they want.
Right.
And similarly, is that free speech? And similarly, if you're a Christian wedding cake maker, is it okay for you to not sell a cake to a gay person, to a couple?
Yeah, both of those things are distasteful. I'm much more troubled by the first one to the extent that, A, it's a public institution, and also you're talking about healthcare when people are super vulnerable. So, no, that's appalling.
Thank you. I agree.
I just had a question about children, how we seem to bring them up these days with, everybody getting a trophy, so no one's offended. You mark a test and you're not allowed to mark in red pen anymore because all those red marks make them feel upset. You got to, mark stuff in black. Is this affecting society? You're talking about good arguments or that. Have you found that to kind of affect things in the way we argue or discuss things these days?
One of the things that I see in the classroom, most of the people that I teach are in their second, third year. I have some upper-level graduate courses, but the bulk of the people I teach are basically second or third year undergraduate students, at least up until a few years ago. And it's hard to know how much this sort of anecdotal observation is just a result of the fact that, like when I was a kid, I was really stressed out about, was I going to get into the right high school? And when I was in high school, was I going to get into the right university? And was I going to get into the right master? I became a professor. I was pretty good at school. I'm not sure I was your average student. So I don't know. But I do get the sense that in an effort not to upset people, particularly parents, educational institutions bend over backwards to make things not hard for people. And I do have a lot of students who seem to struggle with what I'm telling them. Sometimes I'm telling them, here's your grade. It's not the grade that you wanted, and they're upset and that's sad. And well, what can I do? Well, you can do one of two things, and only you know which of these two pieces of advice fits. One, be smarter. If you can do that, that'd be good. Two, work harder. If you're trying the best that you can, then this is as good as it gets, or this isn't for you, and maybe some other thing is. And if you're not trying the best that you can, why not try the best you can? But the idea that you do get a lot of, I've got to be. Is there anything you can do? A used car dealership? No, there's nothing I can do. Write a better paper. This is anecdotal, and as a general observation, I don't know, but I do get the sense that students are pretty surprised when they don't get what they want, and they're told that they simply have to try harder because they didn't get the grade that they wanted. I want to go to law school. That's nice, but I don't have the grades. That's true. What do you want from me? What do you want from me? Yeah, the world is going to be a difficult place if the solution isn't to try harder. So try harder. There's a subset of them who are really well motivated and try, and they're usually the ones who had the good parents, right? Who told them, as I try to tell my kid, I'm bored. Be bored. Life is boring. Try to amuse yourself. I'm upset. Life is upsetting. I'm sad. Daddy's sad too. It's 10 o'clock. You're still not asleep. I'm really sad. Anyway.
Okay, we'll do one more question here.
I was wondering when you're teaching your conservative course,
Right.
If you consider the fact, two things, that the left, the far left, and the far right have one thing in common: they don't change. And another unrelated issue, maybe, as people get older, they tend to become more conservative.
Yeah. So my general approach to the course, and I was talking to the person that I'm going to be, co-teaching. I had lunch with him a couple of days ago. How are we going to do this, right? Because we have our own political convictions. We have our own views about this stuff. And we don't want to do what we say is bad, which is indoctrinate people. So there's two ways of doing this. One is to go in and say, broadly speaking, I'm a centrist. I'm a philosophical liberal. I think people on the radical left and the radical right are all lunatics. And here's why this is crazy. And so cards on the table. Now we're going to cover these materials. My biases. The other way of doing it is just to tell them, and this is what I think I've decided to do, it isn't my job to tell you what to think. It's my job to help you how to think. So we're going to go through these texts. We're going to look at a series of arguments. We're going to assess a bunch of evidence. And this isn't a course in propaganda. It's not a conservatism pro or con. It's a what is conservatism? What is social conservatism? What do social conservatives think? What evidence do they rely upon? Economic conservatism, what is that? What are mainstream or radical economic conservative parties, platforms, policies, politicians? What do they think? What evidence do they appeal to? And if we have a chance, and I actually don't think we're going to have a chance because there's so much stuff to cover here, but if we had a chance, we would get to the critical perspectives at the end and simply say, okay, in light of this sort of survey of conservatisms, what can we make of this? How compelling is this argument? How compelling is that argument? But again, I would adopt the attitude that I mentioned before in connection with the racist or the Nazi in my class. I'll think you're a scumbag if you say awful things and pitch distasteful positions. The job in the classroom is to help you construct arguments, appeal to evidence, and establish claims. And if you can do that right for positions that I dislike immensely, you're still going to get a great grade. So I agree with you. There are lots of things that I think about, the extreme right and the extreme left. Yeah, it's nuts. But again, that's not my job. My job is not, in the same way that I don't think it's acceptable, for private schools and for the church to take vulnerable young children and indoctrinate them. I don't think it's the role of professors to take also vulnerable, impressionable younger adults where they're in positions of inferiority, right? You've got the power, you've got the grades, where you pontificate to them and say, you will believe this, and this is what you're going to think, and in the absence of that, I'll penalize you. Again, in the same way that I think deplatforming is, in a way, doing harm to the university as an institution, that kind of pontificating is also doing harm. That's not what the enterprise is, and I think when it's done badly, that's how it's done. Right? People like me assume that their job is to create converts or disciples, and that's the worst kind of teaching. I have a 7-year-old. If she's at university and I'm paying tuition for some asshole to be feeding her political views, philosophical convictions, ethical ideals that aren't mine, why am I paying for this? I don't want this. It's good that this person challenges her and gets her to think, but just in terms of instilling beliefs, coercively, manipulatively. It's the worst. So I think, at their best, universities are wonderful places. The danger is we forget what the mission is, which is not to teach in the sense of training to think, but to indoctrinate. And then it's a mess. And again, I think there are lots of explanations, but the politics that we see to the south, which I find so distressing, is in large part a result of the fact that either people aren't thinking clearly or have decided you don't have to anymore. You can believe anything, say anything, right? Become unhinged from reality, evidence-free, post-truth. Well, it's fine for a philosophy seminar. Try building a bridge on that basis, or mounting a missile defense, or curing a disease, or, paving the street. Anyway.
Okay, well, big round of applause.
Thanks.
Thanks, Steven Lecce.
It was a real nice meeting all of you.